Hello there again, and welcome to Unit 9, Dairy Cattle Feeding. This section is Chapter 9 in your textbook, so I would definitely encourage you go on and read that section. It's got some great information in your textbook that we will be pulling out and focusing on here in our slide. Here, real simple, just three of them listed. You all can read them on your own, and we'll move on. Very simply, when we talk about feeding for milk production and kind of boil it down to some very general type approaches to feeding operations here, and a couple of questions on the slide here that we have to answer. Number one talks about what types of systems are used for milk production in today's industry. And I think you have to, of course, first focus on the approach of more of a conventional confinement type feeding system with a freestall facility or a TMR type system with where cows are kind of housed and maintained in a pretty controlled environment in terms of what they have the options to eat, even if the feeds are offered more in a buffet style, so to speak. But most everything is provided to them. You certainly also need to recognize that we have a pretty sizable grazing sector of the dairy industry, that the primary focal point of their feeding system is what they can get out of the grass out on the pasture, and then they supplement it just very simply in very low levels of grain in order to help drive milk production a little bit higher, make sure they get all their vitamin and mineral needs met. And then you certainly have the other things out there that are coming along, like organic milk production. That's again a little bit off the take off of the grazing business, and robotics is changing how feeds are fed and how cattle are managed quite a bit differently in today's dairy cattle systems. So the next question says, well, what influences which system is chosen? And primarily, that's a philosophical approach that you take in terms of what you want your dairy to look like as a manager. What do you want to take advantage of? If you have lots of pasture and good quality pasture available, that might be a very advantageous management selection for you, because pasture is generally very inexpensive and is a very economical approach to making milk. Although, when you start talking milk yields, then you give up a little bit of ground, even though your inputs are lower. If you want to drive milk production and milk components really high, then you probably need to be thinking about a more conventional or confinement based system where you have more control over the feeding operations and feed consumed. If you're looking at niche marketing, like in an organic type system or something that you want to direct market milk to a certain sector of customers, then you certainly think about something like that. And then lastly, I mentioned that robotics is certainly revolutionizing the industry. That changes a lot how cattle are fed and what should be available at what different times, and how feed rations are put together. So it all comes down to what you want your dairy to look like and how you want to manage the feeding operations. But bottom line is, feeding is the determining factor oftentimes in the productivity of lactating dairy cattle, and represents at least 50% of the total cost of production. And when we look at nutritional requirements for lactation, and it says here several times that of maintenance requirement, and we're talking 4 to 5 times what that cow needs just for basic basal metabolism or basic body maintenance, 4 to 5 times that nutrient need. So some things to remember is there's a lot of variation in protein content and quality, and energy and forages and concentrates. So we really have to make sure that we think about how we utilize those forages and concentrates in our program. We really have to be taking a very balanced approach and very scientific approach to balancing these diets. We're really going to primarily be concerned with the things like net energy of lactation, crude protein, digestible protein as DP, RUP as rumen undegradable protein, and then amino acid contents in the ration. Minerals and vitamins, of course, get in there too, as important, how we manipulate and feed those. Every good feeding ration starts with really good forage consumption. That's absolutely the most important thing. The last question here on this slide says, what does forage quality have to do with it? Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't make good forages on your dairy, all you're going to be doing is simply spending money trying to put band-aids on that problem the rest of the year. So if you get nothing else out of this slide set, really take special note on the quality and quantity of forages that you put up, and how digestible, how acceptable, how palatable, and how they're stored in your dairy cattle feeding ration, because that should be the baseline of every ration that you put together and constitute probably about half of the diet. So all of that is quite important, and I can't emphasize that enough, that forage is really, really important. Um, that intake then is restricted somewhat of forages by the amount of grain supplementation that we need to put in the diet to support milk production. And I mentioned about half of the diet, we need to stick around that 50-50 grain, 50% grain, 50% forage, 55% forage, 45% grain, something in that range. You can get all the way up to 60% forage, 40% grain without losing too much milk a lot of times. But when you get the opposite direction, let's say 60% grain, 40% forage, you run really high risks of some pretty devastating and costly health problems in your dairy. Another little rule of thumb here that comes up next is silage, and we're talking primarily corn silage or wheat silage, can replace dry hay at a ratio of about 3 pounds to every 1 pound. So if you take 3 pounds of corn silage out of the diet, you would have to put in about a pound of dry hay in order to replace that. When we look at pasture intake, it usually exceeds what we would consider would be normal corn silage intake. And pasture intake is very difficult, and balancing rations that include pasture systems are very difficult to put together because it's very hard to determine how much each of those animals is eating, or each group of animals is eating on a regular basis. You have to take a lot of management approach to figuring out what actual consumption might be. And there's, say, some evidence, and actually quite a bit of evidence, that increased feeding times increases total forage consumption. So the more times that feed truck goes through the freestall barn, or the more times that you go in and push up feed or offer feed to your animals in the barn, the more that they are going to consume. And if there's a little bit of forage variety, sometimes it's not just all corn silage or not just all haylage, that can help increase consumption as well. Concentrates, again, I would caution you, be careful. We want to utilize these in a very smart and intelligent and strategic approach when we start putting concentrates together in mixes. We're talking grains or milled feeds, protein supplements, minerals and vitamins. Essentially every dairy milking cow ration out there is somewhat of a tailor-made or special mix feed that matches the forage program on that farm. You'll not find very many what I will call just cookie cutter or bagged feeds that are put together that matches a ration very easily without a lot of changing or tweaking to the diet. So make sure that you keep in mind that each one of these supplements out there is probably quite special and specific to each operation based upon their forage feeding program, and it will change from year to year and forage to forage as you make adjustments through the year. Also consider what's available and the cost of the nutrients, and we've talked about that a good bit through the section. We have the opportunity to feed things like brewer's grain coming out of St. Louis, or we're not that far away from getting cottonseed out of the South. We have some availability to some byproduct feeds here that you may not find in other parts of the country. Likewise, in places like California, you might find orange peels in the diet, or almond hulls, or something like that you wouldn't see here in the Midwest. So consider what's available and what's economical to put in the diet. But the level of the amount of concentrate that you feed depends upon the amount of forage that you're getting them to eat, the amount of milk production that your cows are putting together for you, and milk fat composition. And I mentioned on the last slide, never feed more than 60% concentrate in the diet. Generally, we're talking about health problems such as displaced abomasum, acidosis, laminitis, all kinds of bad things come along with feeding too much concentrate in the diet. And generally, you might get high responses in milk production for a little while, and then your cows will somewhat crash and burn as they start to experience those health issues. But feed intake, dry matter intake, is highly affected by palatability or acceptability of the feed and the amount of time that they have access to the feed. And we talk about how has feed access changed over the years. You used to see historically feed offered maybe in the milking parlor in terms of grain, or a little bit in the flat barn or tie stall facility, maybe a separate bale of hay out there in the lot, maybe corn silage offered in a bunk feeder or something like that. There's a feed access has changed a lot over the years, and now you see primarily all feeds mixed into one presentation and provided in a TMR. It's very, very common in the States. Or they have access to pasture and then maybe a little bit of TMR up in the lot. And as you get into robotics feeding, then you'll find a TMR system and some pelleted grain offered in that robot milking parlor setup. So again, concentrate feeding levels are always should be appropriate for each operation. And when we talk about book values, I say no book value is very accurate. Everybody's corn silage is a little bit different. Everybody's haylage or dry hay is a little bit different. So when you use book values and do not test your forages, you're probably going to over or underfeed those cows. And so I can't emphasize again, make sure that you have those forages analyzed by an effective and reputable laboratory, and work with your nutrition professional in order to put together a good, effective ration based upon the numbers that you're getting back on your forage tests. So a little bit on steps for balancing rations and lactating dairy cattle. First off, and of course, just like everything else that we've talked about, establish need. Maintenance plus milk production. If you want a good rule of thumb, look at what the dairy is averaging in terms of tank average milk production. So if we've got 100 cows out there milking 80 pounds on average per cow, you might want to balance the ration at about 90 pounds of milk. You certainly want to push those cows a little bit harder. Remember that you got some, if that's the average, you've got some cows that are above that. If that's the average, you've got some cows below that. So you need to push those upper end cows in order to get a little bit more maximum milk production. Next step is determine what's available. What kind and quality of forage do you have out there on the farm? Do you have dry hay available? Do you make your own? Do you buy it in from out west, so to speak? Do you have the ability to make wheatlage in the springtime or oatlage in the fall? And then what kind of concentrate mix balances out that forages that you have to offer? And then establish the feeding levels next. Again, forage feeding appropriate for the quality and production desired. And then supplement only as necessary with concentrates. Keep it as minimal as possible. That'll keep your costs down. Finally, then balance that diet. Make sure that protein and energy needs are obviously met. Look at forage to concentrate ratios. We've talked about that a number of times already. And really start to look at amino acid feeding. That's becoming more and more common, and it's difficult when we talk about a ruminant because those bugs in the rumen really play havoc sometimes with how we can offer amino acids and how effective they might be at getting to the lower gut and the abomasum and the small intestine where they're absorbed. But amino acid feeding levels we know will drive milk production higher and be more efficient. And then absolutely make sure that we recheck mineral and vitamin supplementation, that we are providing the proper amounts, because we will see definite deficiencies there that might have manifest themselves in losses in reproductive success or losses in hoof health, losses in overall cow health. So make sure that we're providing proper mineral and vitamin. Feeding guidelines, we talk about grouping animals based upon stage of lactation, age or dry period. And the last question says, well, what groups maybe should we have on the farm? I'll tell you, have seen lots of good responses to separating out those first lactation 2-year-olds all by themselves, because they're generally have a little bit of growing to do and have trouble competing with those big older cows out there. So it's sometimes very, very wise from a manager's perspective to make a separate 2-year-old group. You also might look at having a separate high group and low group. The high half of your herd gets a separate ration and a more energy dense ration than the low group of your herd, where maybe you might establish a lower energy density ration and cheapen up some of that cost a little bit. And there's lots of other options out there as well, but that just gives you a little bit of snippets in terms of what groups maybe we should be about having. The next few slides goes through maybe some examples of some of those in early lactation or post-fresh group. Let's say maybe 60 or 70 DIM as days in milk or days after calving. Milk production is going to peak probably during this first 60 or 70 days by that 6 or 8 week time frame. And so we really want to make sure that we keep cows very healthy during this time period, but also push them to high levels of milk production. So encourage forage intake, especially early on. Limit the amount of urea. We want to make sure that we have a balanced, soluble protein and a rumen undegradable protein approach here in order to maximize milk production. And keep that energy very dense in the diet. So here's a good time to increase fat content in the diet because those cows maybe will have trouble reaching maximum dry matter intake in this first stage of lactation. This chart here, if you read going from left to right, on the x-axis on the bottom shows weeks of lactation, and I'm kind of going to drive home the point that I was just making on the prior slide. When you have a cow calf at day 0 there on the x-axis all the way over to the left, the red line is milk production. The green line that you see is milk fat. The black line is milk protein. Then the bottom half of the slide, the orange line there is dry matter intake usually, and the blue line at the bottom is body weight. So what you find here is some things that are going on physiologically with the cow. So she's going to calve in at day 0 there and start making milk, and by, like I said, about week 10 she's probably going to be already coming off of her peak. In that time she will have dropped to about 100 pounds, or this slide says about 120 pounds body weight, and that's about the maximum you would allow them to lose. Notice that we haven't reached on the orange line maximal dry matter intake yet. Just physically, those cows have trouble consuming all the feed that they really need to support that amount of milk production. Therefore, that's why you see the blue line dip so much. Then that phase 2 peak dry matter intake is where they're maximizing the amount that they can eat, and notice already milk production is starting to decline. Now, good dairymen can really drive that peak higher and slow the slope down off of that peak milk, and kind of make that curve, that red line, flatter out there as much as possible. That's your goal in order to drive maximal milk production. And it's important, kind of a good rule of thumb for those dairy guys out there, every pound of milk that we can gain at peak is about 200 pounds additional in lactation. So peak milk for this particular example is 98 pounds. If we could take that 98 pounds and add 5 to it, let's say we got them to 103 pounds of peak on average, that's another 1,000 pounds of milk that we're going to get out of those cows during lactation, and improve your bottom line, improve your income over feed cost. All kinds of good things happen whenever we can make that happen. But as long as we don't sacrifice cow health to do that, that's a great management approach. To the next slide, we talked about peak milk, just past peak milk between day 60 and day 140 after calving, or days in milk. Here you're going to again find that maximal dry matter intake. I say here feed several times a day. Morning and night generally is sufficient. You'll find some producers that have gone to 3 times a day, and some occasionally 4 times a day, and some of that might be in response to heat stress as much as anything, to keep that feed cool and fresh so that cows will eat as much as possible. Again, here you're starting to push forage content as high as possible without compromising energy, protein, or amino acid feeding levels. Mid to late lactation, here we're talking about 140 days in milk to that dry period of time, end of lactation. Milk production is declining steadily. Hopefully the cows are all pregnant by this point in time. You got them pregnant hopefully in the previous phase. So they're probably gaining a little bit of body weight here. As long as we don't let them get too heavy, it's a good time to save some money on energy, drive those forage concentrate levels higher, so that those cows make milk a little bit more economically. This slide here, if we talk about phase 3 out there, like 20 weeks in lactation on towards the end, that last phase 4 dry period time, that's the time. Notice that blue line there, increasing body weight. Dry matter intake begins to fall off just a little bit, but it's kind of following the milk production line there. So again, a good time to add forage to the diet, cheapen the diet up quite a bit, and hopefully making sure that we have cows pregnant. The dry off time, and talk specifically, we can break them out as far off dry cows, which would be 21 to 60 days prior to calving or prepartum. Here we should have pretty high forage content in the diet, very little grain feeding, and simply body condition maintenance. We really don't want cows to gain weight during this little 2 month time period or month and a half time period. They should not lose weight. It says maybe slight weight gain. There's a lot of evidence coming along that I should change this slide and say just maintain body weight is all. Whatever they go into dry off, they should stay that way as they get ready to calve the next time. So just enough grain supplementation here to support their crude protein needs, their energy needs, and mineral vitamin supplementation. And actually you should drop your calcium feeding levels, and that's in response to keeping milk fever, which is a prominent disease right at calving time, keeping milk fever rates low. Again, here's that same chart we've been looking at, and so if you get to the phase 4 all the way to the right, notice we've got the blue line here represents body weight and gaining about 120 pounds over that dry period. Again, I would tell you that there's a lot of research coming here that says don't let those cows gain very much weight. That's about one body condition score. So I think today's research would flatten out that blue line quite a bit. Notice the orange line at this point in time. We almost lose 20 pounds of dry matter intake. That's the real struggle right here. The really good dairy producers that have really good transitional cow programs as they go from dry period to milking again the next lactation, keep that dry matter intake as high as possible through the dry period. That's really, really crucial in having a successful and healthy cow going into your next lactation. Again, that 0 to then 21 days prepartum, which is your pre-fresh diet. Here you're making that ration as energy dense as possible because those cows might only be eating 25 to 35 pounds of dry matter. And the primary reason for that is they're very, very pregnant. You're talking about carrying potentially 100 extra pounds of fluid and calf inside of her, and she just doesn't feel like eating very much. And especially in southern Illinois, we talk about periods of heat stress makes them really even more averse to getting up and going to the feed bunk. They just don't want to eat very much. So you want to make sure you make your ration as energy dense as possible. Manipulate those mineral and vitamin concentrations to help prevent post-calving problems. The DCAD listed there, that acronym is dietary cation anion difference, and essentially what we're playing with there is changing the pH of the blood in order to help decrease problems with ketosis and milk fever and DAs and all kinds of things that happen right after calving. But make sure that your feeds are as palatable as possible. Here, this is not the time to be putting poor quality forages in the diet. Make sure that whatever they're consuming is as palatable as possible. Decrease stocking rate. Here I'm talking about instead of having, if you have 10 stalls, you have 10 cows in the pen, you might go down to about 8 cows in that pen. About 80 or 85% stocking density is appropriate. You want those cows to be as comfortable as possible, and then a very, very clean pen. Again, to eliminate health risks and encourage those cows to get up and eat as much as possible. Here's a chart that I found and put together. It comes from University of Wisconsin that shows what pounds of dry matter intake and how much they plummet, especially in the last week. Here's an example of losing about 10 or so pounds of dry matter intake right before calving that last week, and that's really, you would like to keep that dip from happening as much as possible. You're probably not going to eliminate it, but keep that dip from happening as best as you can so that those cows take off that next lactation and make lots of milk in a healthy fashion. Some things to remember here when we talk about feeding the lactating dairy cow is those young growing cows yet. Feed them for growth as well as milk production. That's why I say, what about a separate first calf heifer group? I've personally seen 10 and 12 pound milk responses on those first calf heifers, those first lactation cows, just simply because they have to grow a little bit. And so if you decrease the competition with the bigger, older, mature cows in the herd, they will actually put more milk in the tank and grow a little bit more of that first lactation and be ready to go that next year as well. Generally, more cows are underfed on energy than protein. So, which tells us that we're probably putting too much protein in the diet. They're excreting too much. We're losing money from an economic perspective as we're feeding too much expensive protein. So, balance for amino acids when we can. Limit finely ground feedstuffs in terms of getting too fine. That goes for your forages especially. Don't get that forage ground too fine because you will have problems with milk fat, which indicates a rumen health issue. And include hay. I personally am a big fan of hay in the diet. At some point in time, a little bit of dry hay generally tends to help keep those rumens healthy and keep cows producing at higher levels. Don't don't forget that maximum milk production isn't always the most profitable. And so I like to use the term optimum milk production. What is the most optimal level of milk production that your farm can sustain without experiencing health problems in your herd? For some farms, that might be 75 pounds, it might be 85 pounds, or it might be 115. Just depends on how good you are at putting together your diet, what kind of forages you make, and how healthy you can keep your cows. Have water available at all times, and we're talking 3 to 5 pounds of water per pound of milk per day. So we're talking huge 30 to 50 gallons of milk, 30 to 50 gallons of water, excuse me, that those cows need to drink on a daily basis in order to sustain the amount of milk production that they're probably producing for you. Put fat in the diet, and we're talking about probably about a maximum of 5%. We can't go too high in terms of fat feeding because it tends to cause issues with forage digestion in the ration. The bottom of the slide talks about BST use, and recombinant bovine somatotropin use has dropped drastically because of agreements with prairie farms not to use them in the local area. It does increase dry matter intake. It does increase milk production by about 8 to 10 pounds per day, but you've seen BST kind of fall by the wayside in terms of a normal management practice on the farm. But it's an injectable hormone that kind of basically raises the cow's ability to make more milk. It's a natural hormone that she already makes. We're just giving her a little bit more of it. But again, you're finding that used less and less in today's dairy operations. Let's transition and talk about dairy calves, and this is a kind of a close topic for me. I take particular interest in this piece of dairy feeding. I tend to believe that this is your most valuable animal on the farm. It's your newest genetics. You've spent a lot of money trying to get them, so you, by golly, better take good care of feeding those calves. So make sure that they get colostrum. Basically, get those calves removed from the cow immediately and get colostrum, 2 quarts in them within 30 minutes to an hour if possible, and absolutely by 6 hours after birth. Those calves should have had hopefully 2 quarts of colostrum. And I wouldn't stop at 2 quarts. If they'll drink more, let them drink more. Then you can talk about potentially feeding milk replacer, waste milk, whole milk. There's all kinds of different options here. I've got milk replacer listed on the slide because there's a lot of different various programs there. 20% fat or 20% crude protein, 20% fat is the 2020 diet. The accelerated growth program might reach all the way up to 26 or 28% protein, 24% fat, so to speak. That makes calves grow a little bit faster yet. So I would really be thinking about what is the most advantageous milk feeding program for you. Generally, milk replacer programs are very difficult to beat because it is a balanced diet generally for them. Every day, if it's mixed properly, that powder is the same. And I would caution you against feeding waste milk that has not been pasteurized because you just don't know what kind of protein and fat density is in there. Plus, it's carrying pathogens. If you got the cows that have mastitis, that you're then taking that milk and feeding it to your baby calves, you could inoculate them with some very harmful bacteria that I don't think that you want to deal with in your, like we said, newest genetic animals and most expensive animals on the farm. Talk about calf starters next, and range those things range from 16 to 24% in crude protein. Generally, a sweet texturized feed should be something very, very palatable. Good time to feed some antibiotics. Again, that will change with VFDs, but encourage starter intake as soon as possible. I mean, you want those calves to start nibbling on grain as quickly as you can. And then there's a lot of discussion on when to wean calves, and you'll find a lot of different approaches out there in the industry. I would wean calves when they start to eat between 1.5 pounds and 3 pounds a day of grain for 3 consecutive days. And if that's day 45, get them off of milk. From a commercial perspective, you're going to grow calves faster and more economically if you can get them on dry feed and off of that powder as fast as possible. So get them there efficiently. And most research today says do not offer any hay. This is being researched again, but way back when you used to find a lot of producers feed hay to those baby calves, and we know that the rumen is not fully developed until about 3 to 4 months of age in dairy calves. So feeding a lot of hay, they just really can't digest it. It gives them hay bellies, big pot bellies on those calves, and it just kind of sits there and doesn't really do anything. We know that grain feeding tends to drive rumen development more effectively. So that recommendation has kind of evolved over the years to not feeding any hay at all to those young calves until they reach maybe, let's say, 300 pounds body weight. That's being revisited by some researchers, and U of I is doing some work on this right now that says, well, maybe that's not exactly true. Maybe it's the quality of hay that we were feeding those baby calves that was really causing some of that issue, or the type of hay, alfalfa versus grass versus good quality versus bad quality. Maybe we should be revisiting that in order to drive our costs down just a little bit. So stay tuned to those you guys dairy calves out there on what some of the recommendations may be coming down the line in terms of that as a result of that research. Heifers then between 4 months and 12 months of age, supplement just enough grain here to meet energy needs. Again, rumen capacity sometimes isn't enough to get all of their needs from forages alone, so it's probably going to be necessary to feed them a little bit of grain in this area. And then you got to, again, don't forget, make sure that we're getting vitamins and minerals into those calves as well. Bottom line, I've gotten big letters there. Do not let these calves fat. Don't let them get over conditioned. Two things that will happen. Number one, you will have problems with reproductive performance. If your ration is too energy dense, your calves get overweight. They won't breed as effectively. They won't stick the first time as often. They won't carry calves to term as often. And if they do, they'll have calving problems because of issues at this stage of their life. You got them overweight. The second says decreases milk production capability. You say, well, how the heck does that happen? There's been a lot of research looking into, there's a normal thickness of fat pad that exists where the mammary tissue is developed. And as you get an animal too fat, then the thickness of that fat pad grows, and it actually decreases the amount of mammary tissue that heifer develops and makes, and can severely limit the amount of milk production that she can make over her lifetime, just simply because the mammary tissue didn't have space to grow. Think about a root system under the ground and causing compaction, let's say at about 6 inches deep in the soil. Well, your corn roots don't have the ability to penetrate through that compaction zone at 6 inches, so they just kind of stop or go sideways. Almost the exact same thing happens with heifers, that you get too fat in this 4 to 12 months of age, right around puberty time. That fat pad grows in thickness, and then the mammary tissue, then that root system, does not have the opportunity then to grow like a root system and expand her ability to make milk production over her lifetime. So really control body weight. Again, I can't emphasize enough how much monitoring of body condition is important to feeding all livestock. Heifers 12 months to calving. Here's a good time to save some money. Feed lots of forage, just enough grain or mineral vitamins, and maybe some ionophore in order to make it efficient, but don't get carried away with grain feeding here. We should be getting cattle to breeding weight by 800 pounds by 15 months easily, and maybe even down to 12 and 13 months. And take that number to 550 pounds for jerseys. So if you want to talk about, well, how much weight should they gain on an average day? About a pound and a quarter to a pound and 3/4 gets them to that target weight by 13, 14, 15 months of age. We need to have heifers calving in at 2 years of age because that's the most economical. It takes us about $3,000. Wisconsin research says right now to raise heifers, and every month that you go past 24 months, you're just throwing money out the window. So again, make sure that we're trying to get get heifers to calve for the first time between 21 and 24 months of age is really the target point right now in the industry, and so make sure that we're pushing heifers the right way without, again, over conditioning heifers here to get them too overweight. So you might find things like straw in the diet here, something very high in fiber in order to help control that body weight gain, because they get pretty efficient at putting on body weight if you get carried away with ration energy density here, these heifers 12 months to calving. At about 60 days prior to calving, you can throw them in that dry cow pen that we talked about earlier, and 21 days prior to calving, then you should be getting these first calf heifers into a pre-fresh group. Start adding a little bit of grain to the diet so that they're ready to go whenever they drop that calf on the ground and be healthy and make lots of milk for you. Home messages here. Again, nearly all rations are based on high quality forages. I mentioned that early on. Again, if you take nothing else away from this slide set, really focus on forage quantity and forage quality in the diet. Maximize it the best that you can without sacrificing milk production. Again, that range is 40% on the low end of forage feeding to 60% on the high end if you talk about conventional dairy feeding systems. If you're talking grazing, then you're probably going to exceed that 60% on the top end of forage concentrate or forage in the diet. You might be 60 to 75 maybe in terms of forage density in the diet. Match nutritional needs to milk production as close as possible. Don't get carried away over or under balancing your diet in terms of milk production. Again, the rule of thumb is about 10 pounds over what the cows are currently averaging in the tank. Again, monitor body condition score of your calves and heifers to prevent over conditioning yet get optimal growth. And we mentioned forage to concentrate ratios. A good place to start is 50-50. So when we get to your assignment in class and you begin to start putting rations together on our Spartan Dairy ration balancing program, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is put about half of the diet in forage, start from that point, and then start adding grain to the diet. If you get carried away putting your grains in first, balancing your forages in second will make the assignment much more difficult. So please, hopefully you made some good notes on this section and you have some good questions when we come to class and take our Kahoot and have our muddiest point, so we can have some good rigorous discussion on dairy cattle feeding. I think this one, of all the ones that we've talked about species-wise, is one of the hardest to feed, species to feed because of all the variability out there. You just can't, again, take that cookie cutter approach. It just doesn't work from farm to farm and even year to year on the same farm. So hopefully you have good questions when we come to class and are ready to put together some good, effective dairy cattle feeding rations. So with that, we will see you in class.